Muchísimas gracias por estar aquí. Thank you to everyone that is here today. This morning, we're going to be having a important discussion around our communities and the information that they consume online. And really, I just want to give a quick introduction of how this project started, myself, the organization, and really just talk about where we want to go with this. But my name is Eder Diaz Martinez. I am the communications manager with Green Latinos. And I'm really excited to share this report with you. A few months ago, Mark approached me to really sit down and think about how we can really begin actively doing work within the climate misinformation and disinformation space, specifically in Spanish. And as we already know, this issue is impacting our communities in many ways, but we didn't understand the problem that we were dealing with. And so for us, it was a matter of trying to understand who was out there, who is susceptible, and who was actually spreading and disseminating all of this information. And so we were quickly connected to Michael Koo from Friends of the Earth. And we started having some really big overarching discussions on the issue. And Michael is here, if you could raise your hand. And, he's been such a fantastic partner. So we're really, really grateful for all of his work and his effort in this. And he's led a lot of great coalitions to fight disinformation. And really, through his help, we've been able to culminate up to this point where we have a report where we're going to see how this issue is now impacting our communities, see some of the key players on, who is spreading it, what the key narratives are, and perhaps maybe within this discussion, think about how we can counter some of these narratives and really start understanding what messaging we can use to really share with our communities. And before we get started, I want to acknowledge that there are interpreters on the live stream and there is a webinar. So I would just want to thank everyone that's on the webinar today. Thank you so much for being here, for listening in and tuning in. Thank you so much to the interpreters because when we're talking about this issue, we're talking about specifically Spanish communities. And we want to think about folks that aren't necessarily, don't understand English, right? And they're primarily the ones that are being impacted for whatever equitable issue, whether it's education, whether it's socioeconomics, right? I think that they're the ones that are most impacted by this issue. And so I want to acknowledge that. And with that, I will kick it over to Mark, the founding president and CEO of Green Latinos.
Just for a second. Thanks, Eder. And I want to make sure we give another hand to Eder for all his hard work on this. This is working again. Okay. My name is Mark Magana, and I also want to thank Friends of the Earth for their partnership. So thank you, Michael. They initiated the conversations with us, and we really do appreciate the partnership, as well as the partnership we've had with the people at this table, who I'll introduce in a second. My name is Mark Magana. I'm the founding president and CEO of Green Latinos. We are a nationwide comunidad of Latino, Latina, Latine, environmental and conservation champions. We come together as individuals across different sectors of the environmental movement. Latinos who work in the frontline EJ, Latinos who work in mainstream legacy organization, green groups, academia, government sector, foundation, civil rights, sustainable, corporate sustainability, renewable energy sectors. We are a convener to help to We are a convener to be able to help people to build their own relationships with each other. We each have our own powers, our own information, our own access, our own organization abilities. But we do need the resources that other people in our community have. So how we can break down historical barriers of communication between different sectors of the environmental movement based on the relationships that we build is vital for our ability to achieve the community's environmental liberation that we seek. And so for us, our ability to convene, our ability to connect our members with resources, and their ability to grow so that we can all advocate together is the key to what we do together. So please, when you have time, go to greenlatinos.org, and I'll mention this at the end again, and join us, join our membership, be part of this organization, be part of this group, be part of this familia. Today, we're here to talk about an important issue of Spanish climate disinformation. The issue of disinformation overall is huge, and it's a growing issue, and you see it increasingly in the news. But only recently has the focus been on Spanish climate disinformation. And so our ability to really talk about the consumption patterns, increasing consumption patterns of Latinos on media, social media. We are huge consumers of social media. And our ability to look at that media landscape and the broad spectrum of platforms we have that we view, and to recognize that it's very difficult, or it has been very difficult because the lack of infrastructure on many of these social media sites, to be able to review and monitor and regulate, especially in Spanish, everything that's coming across. And so we wanted to investigate what's out there when it comes to Spanish climate disinformation. It's very easy to put information out there, and with repetition and with tribalism, to really be able to convince people that up is down, left is right, right is wrong, and to be able to have them take a stance on that. And our community is as susceptible as any community to that kind of information. And so this panel today seeks to inform, review, and discuss the problem of Spanish climate misinformation in our communities. Fortunately, we've got experts in this field who've worked for a long time on how this information is disseminated across platforms to our communities and what we can do about it. And so first, I want to introduce Cristina Lopez with Grafica, who really was did the heavy lift when it comes to the creation of this document that is at the front. So make sure you pick up one of these. It's a fantastic report. She's the lead researcher and co-author of Los Ecoilógicos, which is a great name. Our new report we have published with the support of Friends of the Earth. Second, we have Vanessa Cardenas, a longtime friend of mine, of Cardenas Strategies. She's a leader, a strategizer in the community advocacy and social justice space. For the last few years, she's led a coalition of Latino, Latina, Latinx organizations committed to fighting misinformation, disinformation in Spanish-speaking communities. Thank you, Vanessa, for being here. And then finally, we have Astrid Caldas. Astrid, senior climate scientist for climate resilience with the Union of Concerned Scientists. That's a lot of scientists in there. We're proud to have UCS as a partner, and we're thankful for your support for this program. Astrid, thanks for being here as well. So to kick us off, Cristina is going to help us by reviewing the report that you've worked on and highlighting some important takeaways. So if you hit your button, or if you want to, beautiful.
Thank you. Buenos dias. Thank you so much for having me here today. My name, like Mark said, is Cristina Lopez, and I'm a senior analyst at Grafica, and I'm here to walk you through the key findings that our latest report, Los Ecoilógicos, found, and which I co-authored with my colleague, Santiago Lacatos, who couldn't be with us here today. For this report, what we did is we took a look at the network that spreads climate misinformation in Spanish, and we tried to map it. So to get started, I want to look at a roadmap of what we will be covering today. I will start briefly by talking to you about our methodology, how we did this research, how we went about mapping this community, and a short analysis of what the resulting networks of accounts that we found on Twitter were. We will then look at some examples of these influential actors in this community across platforms, and we will use those examples to talk about the structure and the actual characteristics of the network. Then we will move on to cover what tactics, techniques, and procedures these actors deploy to spread this disinformation. And lastly, I will brief you on the most common disinformation narratives that we saw this network spread. So let's get started. So this is the map that we captured that illustrates the Spanish-speaking communities on Twitter that are involved in conversations about climate misinformation. This map is created based on content sharing patterns. And so what we did is kick off our investigation by first collecting some climate misinformation key terms in one hashtag that we saw was being spread in a high volume of tweets that shared climate misinformation. So these terms were alarmismo climático, climate alarmism, manipulación climática, climate manipulation, fraude climático, climate fraud, engaño climático, climate hoax, and hashtag geoingeniería or geoengineering. We use these terms to surface what influential accounts were engaging with them the most. And then we use these accounts to create a Twitter network map of who their followers were. Very clearly, that would illustrate a community of interests of accounts that were interested in spreading this misinformation or following it or being part of the conversation. So what resulted is this map that is made of 2,080 accounts. In the map, every circle that you see there is, or node, is an account. And it's sized relative to the amount of followers it has. And these accounts are grouped, or they cluster into 8 different geographically distinct Spanish-speaking groups. And so content-wise, what we saw is that they were most focused on espousing or spreading content that contained right-wing ideologies or messaging. And you can see the groups marked in different colors in our map with the different labels. As you can see, there's a distribution of accounts that is pretty diffused. They're not all like circled together. And this separation or this lack of density in the groups, what this indicates is that there's low rates of mutual followership within the map. And what that tells us in plain terms on Twitter is that there's not like a core community or network of accounts that are all following each other and exclusively focused on spreading climate misinformation in Spanish. They participate, but that's not their exclusive focus. What we do have is a very loose network. They're all disparate accounts across different Spanish-speaking countries, and they all are engaged with a broader right-wing agenda that includes a range of climate misinformation. And therefore, that's why they are following these accounts that mostly engage with climate denialist tropes. I want to quickly give you an idea of what the groups captured by this map were, and you can see them in this table. This international network of accounts is not necessarily seeking to influence Spanish speakers in the US. Having said that, the shared language does act as a very powerful link in this network. What we see is that also our hypothesis was that the links between Spanish speakers in the US to diaspora communities in their origin countries do make this network a really essential conduit of Spanish language climate misinformation that then travels to Spanish speakers that are in the US. What our analysis showed was that neither of these groups is, like I said before, just exclusively focused on climate change misinformation narratives. but they do engage with the topic in two moments. Whenever there's a response to news events like extreme weather events, or whenever there's a response to announcement about policies that include like action on climate change, or policies that are meant to like invite governments to do something about climate change. So whenever they want to react to these events, that's when you see activity spreading climate misinformation in the map. The map was also very helpful, even though it was small, in extracting more key terms other than the ones that we started with, often used in climate misinformation in Spanish. And we were interested to see what this discourse was like outside of Twitter, in other platforms. So we used this intel to start uncovering other actors spreading climate misinformation on other platforms, and to get a better understanding of the larger ecosystem. So to better illustrate what this larger ecosystem and what characteristics they have, I picked examples of three very influential but very different actors. So let's start with the Epoch Times en Español to your left. This is an actual media enterprise with a very specific marked MAGA bent, and that they have also a really successful platform, multi-platform strategy in several languages. And so they are mostly covering right-wing narratives about current events, but its climate coverage specifically relies on the content from its English language site, the Epoch Times, which they then translate. And while they're not exclusively focused on climate, they have a huge reach. And they also, their content features really high production values that make it really attractive, and does make it a really influential actor in the network for audiences that are seeking content about current events, specifically in Spanish. We also have in the middle, La Derecha Diario. This is different from the Epoch Times in that La Derecha Diario is not really like a media news conglomerate. They're mostly a social media content aggregator. What that means is that they will clip and look around the web for different content for their audiences that could go viral. They predominantly share translations of US right-wing media content that they clip and subtitle or use as like still and macro meme images. They're based in Argentina, so not necessarily like trying to reach an audience in the US, but they are incredibly popular and their content is pretty viral. While they're not exclusively focused on climate, they have a huge like multinational reach in among different Spanish-speaking countries. So that does make them an important vector of climate disinformation that is directly translated from English to Spanish audiences. Lastly, I wanted to focus on an account that is different from the other actors we covered, in that this one is exclusively focused on spreading climate misinformation. They mostly share other denialist tropes and like copy other anti-climate action memes from the web, but they share them with a very limited audience because they have less than 1,000 followers on Twitter, and they're only on Twitter. So their role is that their content gets amplified to the larger network by the small audience of followers that this actor has. So the three illustrate that we have a network that is multinational, that borrows content from English language original misinformation, and that they all reach a very wide audience through different methods. I also want to focus on how they do this. And so after we conducted a really thorough content analysis of all these actors, we did notice some content sharing patterns and shared behaviors that help illustrate how this network acts. And so the first technique I want to focus on is that we noticed a lot of content sharing in which networks of affiliated accounts, for example, the Epoch Times en Español has a number of affiliated accounts and channels on different platforms that are associated to either their news program or associated with another different like content vertical. And what we did see is that among these affiliated accounts, they will share the exact same video with the exact same title. This is pretty common for affiliated networks of accounts in which they use as a content strategy, as a growth strategy, the cross promotion of their content. And so they will have a smaller account that is linked to one of their like broadcast like news shows on Epoch Times TV. And they will share a clip from that content, and then that will get amplified by the different accounts in Spanish from the Epoch Times, therefore like reaching all the different audiences of these accounts and helping them grow. We also saw, in terms of recruitment, networks that are openly affiliated. For example, there is also a content aggregator based in South America that is mostly focused on spreading right-wing memes and right-wing media content, and they're called Radio Libertaria Oficial. They have an Instagram account, and they have an open affiliation, like a site that promotes this with another YouTube channel and Instagram account called The Awakened Citizen, which uses in all of its avatars and branding a lot of symbols from the QAnon conspiracy theory. So that kind of gives you an idea of what kind of affiliation this is. And in their site, they promote a partner program or a influencer network. And what they're basically doing is an open call to content creators that are like-minded, that they can help boost the content and through cross promotion, make their networks grow. This linked accounts are very adamant about censorship supposedly going on. And what they want to do with their partner programs is basically emulate other networks that exist in English language right-wing media that are incredibly good about spreading their content. And the network that they use as inspiration and that they cite in their calls for recruitment is Ben Shapiro's Daily Wire and its network of accounts. And so that is kind of the aspiration of this network, to form a similar network of accounts that can help each other by boosting each other's content. They also, the other characteristic I want to focus on is we noticed very little original content, in that there is a lot of the core of the content that we found was translated from English primary sources into Spanish, whether using subtitles or fully translating interviews or going to the original sources of English language disinformation, like prominent English speaking climate deniers like Bjorn Lomborg or Michael Schellenberger, and then reproducing their content in their own social media accounts, but in Spanish, with like a Spanish what's in it for you for their audiences. We also noticed that all these actors engage in very different tactics and techniques in attempts to evade content moderation or surveillance. We noticed, and this applies to all the actors, big ones and small ones. For example, the Epoch Times does this a lot, where they funnel audiences to less moderated platforms. So they will use mainstream media platforms like YouTube and to post non-violative content that won't get them in trouble. And in the same video, they will share for their audiences a link to their Telegram channels and invite their audiences to join them in the Telegram channels, where they will post the full content that they are not posting on YouTube. A lot of them use YouTube and Instagram as sort of like teasers to pull audiences into closer platforms that have less content, that have little to no content moderation, where they can then post content that would be violative everywhere else. And they do this in the name of censorship. So there is a lot of like emotion that goes into it in calling their audiences into less moderated platforms. We also noticed a lot of use of coded language, in which they avoid using words that would probably get the attention of content moderators or get filtered through in either automated like text content moderation algorithms. And so what we noticed is that, for example, a creator that wanted to advance a conspiracy theory that featured Bill Gates would, instead of saying Bill Gates, would say Bill Puertas, and explain to their audience that he was doing that because that was his way of protecting his channel. And you also see this when they are, for titles, they will spell them differently, including like letters and numbers, so that you can evade, whatever text filter there could be. We saw this idea of using alternative spellings too on hashtags and on keywords, in which we saw some content on Twitter, for example, to talk about calentamiento global would spell calenta and then a period, miento, then separating the words so that it wouldn't come up if you were looking for climate change misinformation. I also want to focus really quick on the types of narratives, and just want to clarify that these are very porous. Like the line between where one narrative ends and when the other one starts is really hard to define. A lot of these narratives contain pieces of another one before it, and all of them you probably have heard before. So let's start with this one. Is pretty prominent across platforms, and it's the idea that climate change was something that was a hoax that was created by global elites, and that the whole idea of combating climate change is meant to benefit elites, like either for more power or for more for financial gains. So we saw a few creators spread this idea. For example, a creator that on TikTok that latched on to a narrative about protests in Netherlands being linked to an intentional wish to make populations go hungry, basically. And so like this idea that behind like calls for saving the planet or fighting climate change, there is just a facade for the buildup of globalism and the control of society. There is an idea that a climate agenda is equivalent to a sort of like religion, and sort of this not a real threat that has been amplified by people in power in order to preserve this power. And you see a lot of different versions of this, and they sometimes incorporate other misinformation, like COVID misinformation, and you see a lot of intersections with other false political narratives. You also have Agenda 2030. This is a huge focus across platforms, and you see that the claims are usually that the climate change prevention is just a part of a broader conspiracy behind Agenda 2030 that is meant to just enhance globalism. And part of this false narrative, you see tropes like they want to make us eat bugs, and that's what Agenda 2030 is. It's a depopulation agenda, and it's meant to control us. It's basically paints this as a nefarious agenda that just looks to conserve power. And it's very linked to the narrative that we just talked about, global elites. This one is also very popular, and we see the same targeting that occurs in English language. Climate misinformation happens also in Spanish, usually targeting the same people, Greta Thunberg or Al Gore, or folks that have been involved in activism for climate action for a long time. You see a lot of targeting that basically kind of diminishes their actions, paints them as hypocritical, paints them as puppets for other major hidden forces that, like we talked about before. And the same memes that we have seen in English are also translated in Spanish. This particular story in which an event that Greta Thunberg participated in, there were other pictures that were decontextualized to say that, oh, the climate activists actually left a huge mess and it was super dirty, and this is why you can't trust them, they're hypocritical. And very few followed up to say that the pictures were actually decontextualized and not part of the same event. We also see the idea that climate change is a hoax, and that underneath all of these narratives is just an exaggeration to basically any of the reasons in the global elites narrative, but this is more an idea that all the science behind climate change is a hoax. And so the cudgel that they use to advance this is the idea that climate action is just climate alarmism, that nothing really is going on, or that whatever's going on is just normal. Lastly, this gets into really conspiratorial territories, and it's the idea that like noticeable climate change patterns are actually geoengineered and caused on purpose by elites so that they can use it as an excuse to insert their globalist agenda. And I'll be happy to answer any questions after. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. I want to delve into the panel real quick. What is the biggest challenge? And I'm going to start with you, Astrid. What's the biggest challenge to combat, counter, and debunk misinformation among the Latino community?
Well, I want to say, we talk a lot about that we are preaching to the choir. That's what they're doing too, right? So they are preaching to their own choir. We have our own choir. So the biggest challenge is for us to be better at recruiting, at bringing our network up, and bringing the information up. Repetition. I think if we repeat it a lot, we're going to be much better shape, because this is what they are doing. They keep repeating the same thing over and over again. And people who want to believe that, they think it's true. They are not even aware that they are spreading this information, right? So we need to do the same. We want people to spread what they think is true. Only in our case, it will be the truth.
Okay, there you go. Okay, great. Hi, everybody. Good morning. Really happy to be here. Well, first of all, this is great. Thank you so much. I cannot wait to dig in further, but I will say a couple of things. Absolutely what Astrid said. I think the right has really benefited because they have built such a huge infrastructure of communications that we don't have on the left. That's frankly one of the biggest problems. But I think to Astrid's point, the notion that the right has really figured out how to coordinate and amplify, and we haven't. So that's, definitely a big piece of the problem. But the other thing I really would just want to emphasize that disinformation is, while it is defined in different terms because it has this social media platform component to it, at the end of the day, it's a communications problem. And that's why it presents a lot of challenges for progressives, because we do not have the communications infrastructure overall, and also within organizations. Therefore, I guess what I want to say about that is that because it's a communications problem, we have communication tools that can help us counter this information. But we're only going to be able to achieve those if we're able to coordinate and amplify among ourselves. And I think that's just a key piece of, how to counter this information.
I feel like I've taken a lot of time. Just for the caveat that I am not a communications professional, but I do echo that at the end of the day, like, this is a communications issue and an amplification issue, and that it can work both ways. These networks exist, like you very well said, because there's a demand for this type of content. There is a demand for folks who are seeking this sort of like ideologically tinted information from resources that are in their own language. And so this is content creators seeing that there is this demand and filling this gap. And this is where those links with like communities from countries of origin and the diaspora communities in the US become really important. And so using those channels of communication for the right information could also be really beneficial.
Do you think that like culturally, Latinos culturally, and it's interesting because the other night at dinner, we were having a conversation about La Llorona and Chupacabra and Cucuy. and about how our parents and elders have used stories on us to alter our behavior, legends. I'm not going to dare call them misinformation because everyone here will swear they've seen La Llorona or Chupacabra or Cucuy. So I don't want to, and every culture has these. And they teach us to do things like La Llorona, stay away from water's edge so you don't drown. And Chupacabra, take care of your farm animals, make sure they're protected and don't be out late at night. And Cucuy, essentially, just don't do anything bad because Cucuy knows and is in your closet or underneath your bed. And so all of these things, as far-fetched as they seem, with repetition, with so many members of our family, generations telling us about these, with the power of our tribe and the culture, as much as intellectually or scientifically we may say, you know, blah, 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 but the most people I talk to are like, yeah, I've seen them. I've felt them. They exist. They're real. And so is the power of our culture, is the power of legends, is that something that makes it more difficult at times to be able to combat other misinformation when it comes up?
Well, I would say that there's, there's definitely a component that disinformation has always existed in our community, right? I think that what's different now is that we have social media platforms that are just bombarding us with this 24/7. And to your point about the lack of other credible sources of information, because as we all know, for example, Spanish language newspapers are in decline, especially smaller ones in our communities. So then we have sort of these bad actors who are definitely trying to harm our community, sort of filling into those spaces. But I think the other point that I really want to emphasize is that we cannot talk about this issue without talking about the role that social media platforms have in this, right? Because we're trying to address a problem that's here for us, but the reality is it's not going to go away until social media platforms actually do better content moderation, hire more Spanish language moderators, and really reduce the spread of disinformation, right? And we can have conversations about algorithms and sort of how that just spreads online. But the reality is, while we're trying to what's the expression, drink from the hose, the reality is the origin of the problem is somewhere else, and we need to have a conversation about that.
I want to say two things. We know the power of stories, like Mark just mentioned, right? Climate change is not a story yet. Climate change is something new. People are afraid of it, but not like the Cucuy. They are afraid because they don't know what it can do. With all those cultural stories, people knew what they would do, right? All those figures would do. So I think we need to create a narrative around climate change that becomes a story with a character, with a plot, and start really bringing that up to the youth, to the young people, from when they're growing up. So because children will remember the stories, right? And if we are not doing what's needed, because we are lacking the power, the network, the means, the resources, whatever, if we bring the new generation up with that knowledge and create those narratives and those stories, I think that would be particularly powerful to go on your idea there. Thanks.
And so we know that social media has really amplified and accelerated the use of disinformation, especially as much as our community absorbs social media disproportionately. Aside from the issue of social media being the accelerator, what is the greatest danger to the Latino community when it comes to misinformation or disinformation in general? Do we feel like it's causing us to act differently or do different things? And what do you feel like is the biggest danger that's coming about because of this?
I would say disengagement, maybe.
I'm with you. I was going to say sometimes there's a lack of motivation because people are overwhelmed. So they distance themselves from the issue and say, well, there are smart people out there that will take care of it. And they do not realize that they are the smart people also that has to be doing something, right? So I think the lack of motivation, the burnout, the lack of knowledge, and the limited sources of information also. I think the power of repetition, I'm going to keep repeating it because I think it's really important.
Well, I think the biggest challenge, or what I worry about and keeps me up at night, is the fact that people no longer believe, they don't know what's truth anymore. And I think particular for a community, that's incredibly demoralizing, right? Because many of us came to this country because we believed, right, in sort of like democracy, American values. We believe in sort of what this country stood for. And then when you have sort of this continuous deluge of lies, and you start questioning what is truth, right? So I think that is, the biggest challenge. That's how it, I think, affects our community the most. And that's why I think our role as advocates, as communicators, as leaders, the responsibility that we have to ensure that, again, we are communicating facts, that we are upholding the truth, and that we are engaging the community in an authentic way. It's just so important at this moment, because, and again, it's not just Latinos that are suffering. The whole country is suffering from this right now, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I would say disengagement and disempowerment. What you see in all of these misinformation narratives is a language or a framing of us versus them, in which the them is incredibly powerful, their intentions are not known. And one thing that these narratives do really well is appeal to real issues, real problems that are going on. And then like the scapegoat is really climate action, or appeal to known community traumas. A lot of people came from really authoritarian countries, are not about to choose that again. And so when climate action is presented as just a little bit of authoritarianism, you do have folks with lived experiences that will react to that in an emotional way. And that makes perfect sense. So that does leave, I think, like the biggest danger is that disempowerment, that feeling like, well, there's nothing to do because they have the power and we don't. And we are not about to repeat what we came from. So I will reject that. And I do think that is one of the consequences.
So to fight that disempowerment, what kind of solutions are out there on the policy level, on the administrative level, at with social media companies? What can be done, and also what are solutions to fight disempowerment among people and families and communities? So first, I'd love to start with the higher level, the policy, the regulatory, the self-policing of the tech industry. What are some of the solutions to fight this disempowerment?
Well, I guess I'll start us off. I think there are right now many robust conversations within the administration, but also with members of Congress about how to curb disinformation. And I think that's something that we should encourage. I think there are also models in Europe and other regions of the world where the companies are being held accountable and are being asked to step up and really address the problem of disinformation. So I think there's a lot that the U.S. can learn from other regions of the world. Having said that, I think what has the biggest impact on the platforms is when there is pressure from key groups, to be frank. For example, we've seen for example, in the State of the Union, when President Biden spoke about the impact of disinformation on kids and the mental health of kids. That came about because parents are organizing to talk about the harms of disinformation, particularly on girls, on young girls. So I think that, again, putting the pressure on the platforms in a public way is really important. And it has to come both from the national, but also the state level. California just passed some policies too around privacy in kids, again, which can be a model for other states. So there are some really good efforts that are happening both at the national and state level that we need to support. But I think it also starts with, again, really pushing the platforms in a public way to step up and really address these concerns.
I think that's the point. We need a hook. We need a good hook. How did tobacco go down? Everybody said, oh, it's my place. I can have people smoke here. It's my place. It's my choice. It's my liberty. It's my freedom of speech. All that is well and true. But once you start impinging on somebody else's freedom, that's when tobacco went down, because it was secondhand smoke, one of the biggest things that helped take tobacco down. So we need a better hook, like what Vanessa just mentioned. We need something, people that have the power. We know people have the power, and we cannot let the other people, the denialists, keep the power and keep just spilling this information and misinformation all over the place. So what better hooks can we get for the impacts of climate change, so that people can really kind of rally around it? I think that would be a good strategy.
The other thing too is like viewing it as a multi-pronged strategy. Like it has to be a yes and, because what we see, and it's already happening, is that at this point mainstream platforms are just being used as a gateway to other platforms. What happens when we can't regulate those? Like that is effectively already like going on. So the strategy can't just be just to pressure the platforms, because already we're seeing alternative platforms growing that are not subject to US regulations and that are offering entire infrastructures for actual movements being built. And so it also includes I think community building that has to happen. I think investment in, not a communications professional, but you do see that there are sprawling networks of communications that like Spanish language speakers are just borrowing content from that's already created. They just subtitle it. So there is unending amounts of content for them to just pick and offer to their audiences. And there isn't like an equivalent, like you said. So those are all strategies and avenues, and not only one of them will be the solution.
Well, thank you. I want to hear from the audience. If you have questions, I'm going to bring the microphone around. I'm also interested personally. I'm not involved as much in social media, but when I do get involved, I get in trouble generally, so I try to stay off. But like, is the answer for us to be on those sites and go mano a mano? But first of all, I want to hear your questions.
Hello, I'm Alex Rodriguez. I live in the Bronx, New York. I work for an organization called Save the Sound. And I want to uplift what Astrid had said earlier regarding refining our storytelling skills and really, really making a pitch to our communities that we are the heroes fighting for climate justice, and there are villains in the story. ExxonMobil, Shell, really getting good at honing that. I want to make a plug for a mentor of mine back in Connecticut, Leticia Colon, who authors children's books, Pesky Plastic and Dinero the Frog Learns to Save Energy. And in that story, Dinero is a frog that teaches kids the dangers of leaving appliances plugged in too long. And the villain is the phantom draw, the fossil fuel, that is, running rampant when you leave an appliance plugged in for too long. I just wanted to bring that up as an example. I have a question for the panel. So in our work, and taking into consideration how low-income white communities were weaponized against the rest of the country in the 2016 election, how do we combat misinformation? How do we ensure the nation that our Latino climate justice framework is for the good of all humanity? How have you combated this issue in the past? Because there was a lot of animosity from low-income white populations towards some of our objectives. Could you give an example?
Well, like we mentioned before, is, you need all the tools in the toolbox, the other point I want to make is like, there's no silver bullet. And this is a problem not just one organization is going to fix. As I mentioned before, the right has created an infrastructure that really coordinates and amplify, and we have to do the same thing. I think it starts again with meeting people where they are. We obviously know that the importance of Spanish language media, and that's something that we should always, strive to engage with. But the reality is also that our community is really gravitating to Facebook, to WhatsApp, YouTube. In fact, Latinos use YouTube at higher rates than the rest of the population. Facebook, the same thing. So, and I understand the irony, right? And this is really what's hard for us, right? It's like, in order to combat this information, we actually have to go to the platforms that are spreading it. And they're making money, not just of us, but also the other side. And that's what I mean, that at the end of the day, we have to talk about a problem with the social media platforms and accountability for them. But I think, again, it requires media engagement, traditional media. I think it requires social media engagement. I think we have to have better narratives about these hard questions about communism and socialism when it comes to climate change, because as you know, the right has really weaponized that. And the question that I have to all of you is like, what is our messaging when it comes to that, right? What is the messaging that really works for our community? And we definitely have some gaps when it comes to that. To your point about our narrative, about what's the story we want to say that it's effective, because we know that the community is with us, right? They understand the impact of climate change. They understand the harms that they are suffering, because they are suffering it firsthand. And I think it's a challenge for us to sort of how to translate that into support and action, because the support is there. So I think from my perspective, is like what we are lacking as progressives is really come up with the messaging and really the answers to these really hard questions to get our community squarely on our side, because the right is taking advantage of the fact that we are afraid to engage when it comes to these issues in a forceful way.
I don't think I can add anything.
I'm so sorry that we're running out of time, but please ask some questions of if the panelists have time, but we're gonna take one last question from online.
Yes, thank you. And thank you to the panelists and everyone that's listening at home. We do have a question from a reporter, well, a couple questions. Number one, why do you believe these actors are targeting Spanish-speaking communities in particular? Number two, the panelists said this engagement and disempowerment are the greatest risks, but what does that mean exactly? Can we give examples of what this engagement and disempowerment looks like with regards to policy, voting, etc.? And lastly, what exactly is the gap these groups are filling? Do you mean that Latino communities seek accurate climate information but aren't finding places to get it?
Can you repeat the first question?
Yes, the first question, why do you believe these actors are targeting Spanish-speaking communities in particular?
Because the actors themselves are Spanish speakers, and the idea isn't necessarily like to target Spanish speaking communities. The major mission that they are engaged in is spreading right-wing messaging. It's an ideological mission. Like, these are all ideologically driven actors. So they're creating content, and there is absolutely some demand in audiences that seek out a like ideological messaging in their own language. And so these are the actors that are providing this. And so it's not so much that they're seeking accurate climate information. They are seeking like an explanation for current events. They are seeking, like how to navigate the world and what's going on. And these actors are providing like alternative explanations with an ideological leaning that kind of fill that gap. When I reference disempowerment and disengagement, it's directly translated into what happens when you constantly hear that climate change is a hoax, that it's been geoengineered, and that, these are all things that challenge your ability to like assess your reality. And so you have extreme weather events, but they've told you that it's a hoax. So you might as well not even engage with climate action, not even engage with community activities that could combat that, or like write letters to your representatives, because that has led you to believe that you have no power and that action is futile and that this thing is made up. They are just using it to control me. And so it does lead to disengagement from the issue, to disempowering folks that could absolutely join climate action. That's really what I meant.
Said it all.
I guess I can just provide other examples of how this really translates to communities. And the reason we say this targets community, but actors target communities. For example, we know, I'm sure you all remember the Vanessa Guillen case, right? That she was murdered. There was a lot of disinformation trying to create wedges between Latinos and Blacks because of that. And they were saying that, and the bad actors would say things like, the accused person is African American. How come Black Lives Matter doesn't say things about that? Again, narratives that are meant to create racial tensions between groups. There's lots of examples around voting, right? Providing voting disinformation. Why? Because they want to disempower a community, because they want to give them the wrong information so our community it's not going to participate. Climate change, again, we know that that transitioning to a green economy is going to improve work jobs and salaries for our community. So there's a lot of disinformation that goes against that, right? So there are specific ways in which the community is being affected by these narratives, not just in a emotional and sort of like social cohesion way, but also sort of to their pocketbooks, to their economy, to their beliefs. So there's, again, lots of examples of how that affects our.
And I would just add the appeal of the language, right? We all like our, mother language, our native languages. So you have the appeal of the language. And in addition, you have that perception, that bias that you are reading something in your own language. And many times you're more likely to believe it because it's in your own language. So there are social sciences that are doing a lot of stuff in terms of communication also, in terms to try to figure out how people engage, why they engage, and why they have the reactions they have, so that we can use that to better engage people in the issues that we want to engage.
Great. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for being here. We are now a little bit over time, but again, thank you so much for being here. Thank you to these amazing panelists. And if you haven't seen the report, it's up front. Go ahead and grab it. Sorry that we couldn't get to everyone's questions, but I'm sure that they'd be happy to answer them in person here, now that they're here, and share some knowledge and their contact info for any follow-ups. Thank you.